Hey, hey everyone. So we have a proposal to have a knowledge sharing session from Jay. Jay was working to recently with service ping data, and he was sharing some interesting analysis there. I think that would be interesting for everyone to participate. Next step would be to set up a timing for this session, and there's an issue there. Please have a look with a link to the work that he was doing, and maybe add some topics that might be useful for the presentation preparation. Yeah, that's it. Tim,
I like that. Yeah, I like the idea a lot, especially as including myself. We have a lot of newcomers to the topic, especially to service ping and all the implementation. And I think that would be a great start to actually figure out then how we can transform topics also to service ping and leverage things here and there, and what to build into the product and what to leave custom. I think there are still a lot of topics left to figure out along the way. Good. Then I believe I'm next. I indented it in the way that I would have another topic, but I actually haven't. So I just make it like this. So a huge topic that I think is still very, very open, and I would love to hear everyone's inputs, and that's why I haven't added it to any sort of issue so far, because it's something we need to figure out where to put it first. And I would love to hear your inputs. Is mainly session segmentation. So in the POC that we did, this was 100% based on queries that we did in the aftermath in Cube, which is possible, but I think it's a classic POC way to do it. And I think it would need a lot of CPU power than in actual production instances to actually build something very weird over the head and around 5 corners to figure out what a session is. And I think that is something we definitely should do in a level earlier, like in the tracking or even in the data transformation that we are, where we also have a couple of options in Jitsu itself. So I would love to hear everyone's input, and especially everyone working on the product intelligence parts of where would you love to have session segmentation, in the sense of, okay, this is a session, here it starts, here it ends. I think that's the main thing I think that I'm looking for.
So Jitsu's got that anonymous session ID, which I don't know if we've verified yet whether that it seems based on my testing that at least for that given session it can change for the same user ID, but at least for the duration of that session it stays the same, similar to I think how Snowplow does it with like I think it's called like the anonymous session ID. Is that, were you looking for like how we can actually attribute it to like a specific user, or like how far would we go with like session segmentation?
So what I would love to have is that we have a rule that we can set up in reality what a session means. So this means basically everything that you did from a starting point, the first time you hit a URL or an action, because we could also track mobile apps in reality. But let's say a URL, the first time where the session starts, and then up to a certain point until you have reached a certain amount of inactivity. So this could be 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour. So that in reality, if you do something in the morning, go for lunch, come back a couple of hours later, go to the gym, come back an hour late. I still can't do meetings yet, coming back from PTO, and then come back in the afternoon to the application. Would this be a new session? I would say yes, so that we basically can easier group activities with each other and have a better understanding what a workflow of one thing at a time is. And if, as far as I have seen, but I think someone should deep dive into that with Jitsu, is that if you have a customer, then this gets immediately picked up again, even on another day again, and is basically connected again to this user anonymous ID, which is simply created once. But I think it would be, the best part would be really to have a definition that we can even go up to the product, that a project can say, okay, I want to have that a session ends after an inactivity of 1 hour or 24 hours. And that's up to the project itself, based on most probably also rather what they are doing and what their use case is.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a good deep dive that needs to happen with Jitsi, because there's a lot of different parts there where it's like, okay, we have that anonymous user ID, but that's, or session ID, but it's not like, I think it's more in line of how you defined it in terms of like, it's a session that happens like in the morning, but then if you come back, it's the same user in the afternoon, it's a different ID. I think you can associate that, but that would probably be a different point of discussion, and also something that users would have to opt in or out of. But then we'd also have to understand if we can change the interval of how it like resets that. I don't know if that's just purely cookie based or not. So yeah, I think a deep dive for Jitsi will have to be done for us to understand the capabilities it offers and the customizability and how that matches up with how we would want to define a session.
I think if we can, we should try and find a term other than the word session to refer to this, since that's such an overloaded term in the space.
Everyone calls this sessions in tracking. Snowplow calls it sessions. Jitsi calls it sessions, and they usually have a configuration for how long that threshold is before they stop counting it as part of the current session and generate a new session ID. So if we went with a different name, it would be confusing to people who understand how all of the other libraries kind of talk about this thing.
Okay, so this is the industry term everyone's using for this sort of functionality then.
At least with my experience. I don't know, maybe someone else has thoughts about that.
Maybe it's something we can validate, and if we need to change direction to use a different word, we can. But yeah, we can go with session for now then, if that is the industry term as folks understand it.
If you are around it, I would like to raise an idea. Since we are about to define how we allow project owners to define what the session is and how long it takes, I think that there may be a great opportunity here to also include very privacy-friendly approach. I absolutely loved how GitLab experiment defined the migration keys or experiment migration keys, which were independent from any attribute, because like right now, how we provide the privacy is by pseudonymization of user IDs, which is not perfect because it's based on some constant data plus some secret, which can be leaked, can be without enough computing power, cracked, etc. But if we define, or at least I envision that if we use similar approach as was used by the GitLab experiment, when you just chain the randomly generated IDs that were assigned to the sessions and keep track of them pointing to the previous one, we still can get the user level tracking, but with the very privacy-friendly way, because this identifier wouldn't be tied to any form to the natural person, rather than just being assigned to it. So I just wanted to raise it because it may be a very nice thing to include, and if you do it in advance, it may be way easier than to try to build this retroactively.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk about that idea and things that I learned from implementing that and being and the lack of understanding, my inability to communicate the benefit of that to other people at the company. So yeah, happy to talk about that if there's any questions.
So Tim, I think we're generally interested in it. Does that kind of give you enough for us to like define and start pursuing in terms of like conducting these deep dives into how we can put this further upstream? So like I think we're generally in agreement that it should happen earlier rather than later. So if we can get into Jitsi, does that satisfy your point? I guess is what I'm asking.
Absolutely. And with Jeremy, I think we have the right person there on the team to work also with everyone from product intelligence, open an issue, put out a proposal, and then we get everyone's input I think that's also was one of the discussions that we had so far in the Slack channel, was really about how we are going to do tracking around schemas, etc. And this is now the time to define all those points of what can we do, reuse as many things that industry has provided us and is doing, but also see, okay, what can we rethink a little bit, or that we have re-implemented through hard ways to basically learn snowplow, and sessions are one of those topics. So yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Nice too. Yeah, there's also this feature they have called retroactive user recognition, which I can openly admit I do not fully understand. So I wonder if that's something we could potentially leverage as well. But yeah, that'll all come with the deep dive. Cool. So I just have a couple points. So one with the setting up analytics on GitLab.com. There was already a Slack thread that Sam had opened up about this, but obviously, given the recent news regarding our work with the free usage tier and inactive project deletion, I imagine we'll want to just make sure we handle with great care on how we approach the announcement and gathering of feedback for when we inevitably move towards setting up analytics on GitLab.org. Even without the intention of opening it up wider than that organization, it still has, as we discussed last week, people who aren't team members or part of the company. So we'll still want to. I think that process will take quite a while. But Sam opened a Slack thread earlier this morning on whether or not it makes sense to maybe start with the internal handbook, which I think will be a good step towards how we announce it for .com. So that might be a good iteration towards that. But I'm curious if anyone has any other thoughts on that. Cool. The other thing is, yeah, dev kit's getting really close to being, well, for development purposes, Kubernetes ready. There's a lot more work that has to happen with to get it to production, but thankfully there's a lot of work that observability and OpsTrace has been doing with their ClickHouse operator to basically scale out ClickHouse clusters. At the same time, as just kind of what my current focus is, I've been diving deep into how resource management and like destination management works for Jitsi and how that can potentially be orchestrated at the same time. Kube, as it currently stands, when you deploy it, is very open, and so you need to supply security context in order for that to actually scope queries. So it does seem supportive of having kind of like a shared data pool, but then scoping it such that once you actually access Kube, you only see the data you're supposed to. So that's part of what I've been looking at and how that ties into a production deployment and how that can be managed. But yeah, that's pretty much what I'm looking at. Jeremy, you have the next point.
Yeah, so been kind of thinking about how we want to try and model the event data that we collect, and like how we present that kind of thing. So when I'm looking at a project, can I see the analytics sort of from that? Is it related to that project? Is it related to a namespace or group? How do we want to do the analytics in the interface, and what does that mean for how we default query these things? Or I guess just kind of thinking about that, if anyone has any thoughts.
As I'm always much faster speaking than typing, I will try to talk it out. The only thing that we decided a couple of weeks ago was that Kenny and I, that we simply will base this on namespace group level so that you have analytics. But I think it would be really good to also have some sort of connection of one property maybe in a project. The question is also, do you rather, if you take like a tracking instance, which has then basically Jitsi, ClickHouse, and Kube, does that also have multiple projects inside? So in reality, you could also have one monorepo, which is tracking a handbook, a mobile app, and the website. And suddenly you have basically 3 different properties that you would go ahead and start tracking. And the rest is, I think it would be good to connect to one of those instances on on a namespace level, so that you can also, what we will need is most probably DNS and custom domains and stuff like that, so that we don't have too much hassle with domains, etc. most probably. And then they can create like properties. I think they are also called in Google Analytics and things like that to start, okay, I'm tracking something against this, but this is something, a classic topic for product management. So just all the topics that I had in my mind from the instances we looked so far at.
I was wondering if like using environments, like 'cause that's a property that is common in tracking. So maybe you specify the environments as, you know, staging, marketing and production application, staging application. But do we want to try and build in tooling that makes that like understandable to people or something? I don't know. Just kind of thinking about that.
So I'll give my opinion here, and feel free to challenge this because I wasn't in some of those discussions with Kenny previously. So since we're not just going to be looking at GitLab, but how our own users are going to deploy this to their apps, they're going to have unique deployment models that might not fit our current project group namespace. The way that I would think that we could do this is we have one instance of the tracking cluster, or a way to segment that tracking cluster into, Tim, your example of, the mobile app, a web app, and a desktop application, and having some sort of attribute in the tracking cluster be the way we could differentiate between those different applications. And then on a per application basis, that's where the experience around visualizations, consuming the data, and getting insights from it would come. Now, whether that sits at the root level group of a namespace, a subgroup, or an individual project, I'm not so sure what the right answer to that question is, but I think if we do the bifurcation of what all that looks like on the whatever that property is in the tracking stack is, then it just becomes a matter of, well, where do we put this in our GitLab hierarchy of access to it? Does that make sense?
I didn't quite follow the last part, to be honest.
So whether we put it, by the last part, whether we put it at the projects level, a subgroup level, or only at a root group level, I think that decision can probably come later. I think in terms of the data, if it has some sort of attribute that ties it to either a specific tracking cluster of that JCC stack, or there's something in all of the data in that tracking cluster that says this is for a mobile app, this is for the second mobile app, then we can figure out where it lives in GitLab later.
I guess let me rephrase my question, because I'm thinking about this visually, so that then I can figure out how we want to try and model this from an engineering perspective. When I, as someone who is like, let's say, because I come from the growth team, I can think of the PM's perspective from the growth team fairly easily. So if I'm on the growth team and I'm tracking some information that I'm trying to figure out if I want to like roll out this feature or spend more time on it or not, I'm like, where do I want to see that information? When I go to the GitLab org top level namespace, do I want to see all of the metrics that people have defined and try and find my specific view of that data in some very large bucket of analytics presentations, like let's call them widgets, views, whatever, or do I want to go to like a sub project that I've created that's maybe about this specific thing, or do I want to, can I create, how we have like issues that are like not part of the GitLab project? I can create a separate group and have issues in like that thing and have discussions in that. Like, how do we want to model it? Because it's important for how we store the information about how we want to present the data, how we want to, does that make sense? It's like the tracking events, like, will all go into the one system, but like, how do we want to allow it to be viewed? Do we think it's more confusing to have it at multiple layers because I may struggle to find something that someone else has set up? or do we want to have it like, or do we think it's more confusing that it's like one bucket, like one place where I go to try and find everything? And that's like what I'm thinking about, is because one of the things that we've talked about in some of our one-on-one meetings is settings. Like, can we do like a YAML file for like the configuration of all of these views and how we present the analytics in some useful way? And so then when I think about modeling that, I'm like, how do we want to present it? So
yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think at the smallest unit, we could put it at the project level, have that be specific to one application. Then the question becomes, what does the aggregate of all multiple projects, what does that experience look like? I think doing that at the group would make sense in that case. But that could also be confusing if organizations have, because we've seen this with a lot of our customers in other categories where they'll have like a division that has a project under one division's root group, and then another division with a project under another root group. And then how do we combine those two? Probably the aggregation of all that, probably a harder use case than the single, we just put it in the project, you get project specific information at that point. So I don't know if that's the answer to your question. It sounds like we probably could do some more research in this area to figure out what pros and cons of different approaches are.
Yeah, it's going to really depend on who you ask, because like depending on if someone's like yeah, it just depends on the hierarchy of the organization. But then it also then you can also say it depends on how the organization sets it up. But like, you know, perhaps you have someone who's like more in a management position that wants to see all the different like dashboards at a higher level without having to jump into each individual project. But then you have people who are more like handling the day-to-day for a specific project, so they don't want to have to go at the higher level to, you know, dig through a number of dashboards to find the one that they're interested in. So I think ultimately you'd want it accessible in all levels, but then just have it scoped down. But then that gets more complicated based on our permission model. And that's a whole separate topic of like, who's even going to be able to see these. And then that then segments into, well, who can see it at which level. So I don't really know where I was going with that, other than it's a really complicated problem.
yeah, that's kind of like,
that's why we're talking about it. So
yeah, yeah.
Well, wouldn't it make sense if we did something that you get all the data at your root group at your namespace level, and then just provide controls to segment it down to just the mobile app, the web app, desktop app at that point, rather than spread it across multiple projects?
That's essentially what I'm talking about. Like the data will be available at, like, you can just say like, oh, everything in this project is querying some, you know, like for this environment or this application name or whatever we, you know, however we decide to do that. But it's like, I'm thinking about it from the interface perspective of like, maybe I have like complex dashboards in projects and I only have discovery so that I can find the information for that. I don't show all of the dashboards at like the group level for that project and the top level group. I like have a different type of way of discovering where the data will be presented to me for specific things. I don't know if that's another way of trying to say it, but
it's not clear
So
if you're proposing. I'm not
proposing anything. I'm trying to get like the thought around how, like, so that then when requirements come in for like, let's make sure that we can, you know, version control these widgets, these dashboards or something. It's like, well, how do we want to model them? So I'm just trying to get people to think about that.
Really good point. I get it now that it might be that we have, let's call it the mobile app, or let's call it the website, because it's easier. That's our main use case. And you have simply one team that is responsible for the checkout, and they want to see mainly in their project what happened, or everything that happened to the checkout, and have specific dashboards that are just specific to their experiments and so on. Right?
Yes, and because I actually see, you know, how we can link to MRs and even feature flags and like comments. Like I would imagine that people would want the same tooling for analytics. I'd want to be able to link to dashboards. I want to, and you know, like when we think of the vast amount of data and how we can present it in different ways, the challenge becomes managing how you interact with all of that stuff. So how do we want to structure that? Like, can we link to them? Can I link to specific views in my dashboard? In like, however, well, you know, we need to come up with words for these things. And
yeah, exactly. Wording is the hardest part. I think that one topic that comes to my mind is rather to link one-to-one, so that basically a project contains everything. That if we build up a good meta system like Grafana has, for example, where you have simply tags and labels and stuff like that, and good descriptions per dashboard. Because the biggest fear is what I've seen in, just look at our Sisense. We have in Sisense, duplicates with exactly 3% difference.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I'm missing, for example, for if I'm looking at Sisense, and if you then segment basically dashboard A and dashboard B, is that a lot of topics like tags, not tags, they are called. So where you basically can say in a graph, okay, by the way, we have released feature A exactly at that point. So annotations, thank you. Annotations to a certain point is that you have them exactly on one graph in one dashboard. And I think that then I'm looking over to another thing and I'm like, I'm missing the whole thing. So I think that if we are able to solve those things, that we have reusable components also to some extent, so that you can have views versus dashboards, and we are not reiterating every time and then have 15 different outdated dashboards, I think then we would also be ahead a lot of other areas.
And I think that's actually where the big challenge is. I mean, we're looking at like this really near challenge of like what does the infrastructure look like for this? But then there's these like really big challenges of how we manage the presentation of it. Because I see that being the big challenge at GitLab. We struggled with using Sisense. And so.
Well, definitely. I mean, as far as next steps, and we're also approaching time. Jeremy, would you be willing to open up like an issue or an epic where we can carry this conversation async and continue to kind of determine what kind of discovery needs to happen for us to continue to narrow this down? Jeremy, that was directed at you.
Oh, do you want me to open an issue? Yeah.
Yeah, if we can carry that async, since we've only got 2 minutes left, and there's definitely a lot more discussion to be had there.
For sure.
Awesome. Thank you. Anyone have anything else they would like to bring up before we call the meeting? All right. Thanks, everyone, for bringing up your topics. There's nothing else. Please have a good rest of your Monday and good rest of your week. Take care.
Take care.